Hey gang, today we are in New Iberia Parish, which is in Louisiana. We're not too far from Lafayette. We're just southeast of Lafayette, and we're on our way to New Orleans, which is just that away to the east. Wanted to stop here at St. Peter's Cemetery. It was founded in 1838, and indicative of all the cemeteries around here, everything's pretty much above ground or in stepped formations because of the groundwater, of course. We've talked about this, came back to New Orleans. We're going to see a lot of this. We're going to see a lot of vaults and crypts and stepped graves, as we call them. And we're also going to see some, a lot of unusual things. And of course, I've explained back then how these crypts are shared by associations or families, and how the remains are put there temporarily, a year and a day, and put to the back or carried off. That was in the past. I've explained that, but we're going to see a lot of that here. But we're really here. I really wanted to stop here. Alice, our moderator, had told me a story about back in the day. It was the trunk murders. We're going back to the 1920s here in New Orleans. It was quite the happening place. There were a lot of eccentric people here. There were artists and composers and architects, and it was the happening place. And well, it was a transition place for a lot of people, and also a lot of murders and a lot of crazy things happening. And this particular murder is most interesting. I believe it was called the Trunk Murders, and it involved a trunk. We have two sisters. We have these two sisters who were married and living kind of common together, near or next to each other, or with each other, the husbands, and something really bad happened. So I'll tell you the story as we walk along. And of course, as we walk, we're going to see some very interesting crypts, like these here. We're right by the front gates. We're going to start our walk. And as I was saying, and as we talked about before, many times you can just see all the names, many names on these crypts. And in many cases, there remains a year and a day, and then pushed to the back, and then the next one comes in. It's quite an interesting procedure, out of necessity here because of the conditions, the flooding, everything else. A lot of diseases, yellow fever came through these areas, and when that swept through, they just had nowhere to bury the bodies. So a lot of this evolved over time. Now, this story happened in October of 1927. We're going to go to October 27th of 1927, and it all happened when a cleaning woman came to the room. The address there, again back in New Orleans, was 715 Ursulines Street. And she set foot inside the room, and the first thing she saw was some blood. In fact, there was blood all over the place. So she called for help. Two men came to help her. They called police. Police came, and they investigated a little further. Of course, they came all the way into the room, and they would just see a scene of horror. There were two small traveling trunks that were sitting there, and each had been very carefully loaded, packed. What were they packed with? Well, corpses, butchered corpses. The butchered corpses of two young women. There was a blood-soaked mattress where the victims were laid out originally, where this all had happened, apparently. There was a bathroom covered in blood, and there were severed fingers laying on the floor like a cookie trail. They figured out that the killer had first bludgeoned the women with some type of lead club, maybe a billy club, and then whoever it was decapitated them. How did they do it? They used a machete. And then they went about amputating their arms and their legs very carefully, very precisely. There was a gold wedding band that was buried deep in a gash in one of the victims' back. The clothing had been tossed from the trunks, of course, to make room for the corpses, and that was strewn all over the apartments, the tenement. And there were other human remains. Everything was just chaos. Now, the victims were both in their mid-20s. They were originally from here in New Iberia. And their names, Theresa and Leonide Moidey. They were married to the brothers, Henry and Joseph Moidey. And most interesting, Leonide had left behind a compelling clue, a written clue, on what may have led to this, what may have happened. She had written a story before she moved from here. It was for a women's magazine, but at the time it was rejected, sent back. But she talked about, in the article of her writings, of finding joy again after a failed marriage. And it outlined how her poverty didn't matter. She was living happily with her husband and young children. But she said with an ominous warning, quote unquote, "Now to you readers, young girls especially, please think ahead of you and do not make the mistake I've made. Do not, because it does not always turn out the right way. You can still be disappointed. Guess it was only my luck to be happy like this, so I warn others not to take the same risk." One line, a piece of advice given by her father, she wrote, haunts this story. She said, "My father said, 'Be careful, for marriage is a life sentence.'" So the New Orleans police superintendent, his name was Thomas Healey, he started looking into the case himself. And he first focused, of course, on the husbands. Now, Leonide's husband, Joseph, turned himself in that evening. However, Henry, Teresa's husband, he was nowhere to be found. Both couples and their young children lived in this small apartment, and Joseph had told police, "Hey, we just moved in here not long ago, and Leonide was caught with another man." And the neighbors could hear fights, yelling, screaming. It was about money. It was accusations of infidelity. What it sounded like fighting and actually physical fights, banging, booming. Now, again, focused on Henry, he had headed to a place called Camp Street boarding house, and he was planning to leave the area. And they were already on to him. They got the description out, be on the lookout. They radioed the ships. There were 7 ships sailing out of New Orleans that day. And they said, "Watch out for this guy. He'll probably not use his name." They gave them a full description. They described him as having dark bushy hair, very dark brown eyes, tattoo marks on his arm, a tattoo with a flower with a lady face, also a nude woman. And it wasn't long, on the 29th, on Saturday, 2 days later, a freighter, a ship crewman, saw and reported him, Henry Moidey. He had apparently begged his way on the ship, using, of course, the false name, as predicted, but they recognized that tattoo. The tattoo was even in the newspaper stories, and they identified him. It turns out that Henry was indeed jealous, because they did bring him in, and he did make a confession that he was the one who did it. He said he was enraged. He was enraged that his wife was having an affair with the landlord, Joseph Caruso, and Theresa was going to leave him. He also said, Henry said, that she neglected the children. And he also resented Leonide for having influences over his wife, Theresa, saying bad things about him. And that's why he did it. So what happened? Well, there was a trial, of course, and he was found guilty. No surprise. And he was sentenced to 2 concurrent terms of life in prison. Well, he went off to prison, Louisiana State Penitentiary. It was July 6, 1928. And it is said that he lived a pretty good life there. He got used to it. He was comfortable. In 1934, they trusted him. He was on his good behavior, so they gave him some assignments, special assignments where he wasn't really guarded and he could just kind of do what he wanted. He took advantage of that. In the summer of 1944, he was going to the post office. He had reached that level where he could go wherever he wanted. And he just decided, I'm just going to leave. Not sure where I'm going to go, but I'm out of here. And he just walked off, got a taxi, and he went to Hammond, Louisiana. From there, he caught the Illinois Central Panama Limited to Chicago. And he was on his way. Now, the prison warden, he didn't seem too concerned. He said, Henry, he'll come back. He's been here like 16 years, and he has a chance of being pardoned. I'm sure he'll be back very soon. But he didn't come back. It was 2 years later that he was stopped for suspicious behavior. He was in St. Louis, Missouri. And he just said, I'm Henry. I did this and I did that. And of course, what did they do? They sent him back here. They sent him right back to prison. So he's back in prison. And he did get his pardon. The Louisiana Pardon Board recommended his release in 1947, even after all of that, 21 years after the murders. But there would be trouble ahead for him. I guess he had a temper. He had a rage. He moved to California, and in 1956, with his girlfriend, they were at a hotel in Los Angeles. Her name was Alberta Orange. What does he do? He shoots her in the chest. Got in a fight. What do? Shoot her in the chest. Well, she didn't die. And Henry was sentenced to 5 years in Folsom Prison for attempted murder and assault with a deadly weapon. And there is where he died, 1957, at Folsom. He died of a stroke. And it seems like he was a happy guy. He was pretty content with his life. He obviously didn't try to change his ways or anything. So he's buried there at the Folsom Prison Cemetery, but you can't go see him. I did check, not for him, for somebody else. Just like Leavenworth and some of the others, you can't go there. They don't let you. So when I got here, the sisters, I was focused on Teresa's grave, and even with the cemetery people here, all the records, there's nothing. So I looked for her parents, and I found I found her father, who was buried, I shouldn't say buried, interred here in a vault. Everybody's in vaults, as you can see. And I found him, and I found Joseph next to him. So everybody's together. Mama Anna is not shown, but I'll bet she's here. And there's a vault right next to the father that's unmarked, much older. I think that's the women, the sisters. And it is right over here. Right over here. If you see where the flowers are, so there's Joseph. Here's Joseph's grave. So I believe that we have Joseph 1904 to 1948. I don't know how he died. And I take that back. We found Joseph. We found the family. And I believe that when I was referring to the father, I'm guessing he is in here, possibly with Anna. Now, judging by, well, it's hard to judge. This one here, Frank Joseph Alfano, who was a private first class in the Marines, passed in 2006. You can see that the vault cover is much newer. And you can see here family is visiting. There's Samuel Alfano Sr., passed in 1962 right there. But this is the brother Joseph, right? Has to be, yeah. With the flowers. A simple marble stone. So there's really nothing else here but this vault right here. And I am, just looking at this one here just to make sure. This is another family completely. So you have them all lined up here, but I wonder why this one is not marked. I'm betting they're all in here. The sisters' remains and the parents. And they may be unmarked because of this story. Many times they don't want the attention, right? So, there it is. That is the story. Beautiful. We're going to see a lot more of this here as I get into New Orleans. See you soon.